Dear Peter Eisenman, dear Cynthia Davidson, also known as Ms. Eisenman, as you just told me a moment ago, dear Regina Leidinger, dear Mr. Foster, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this event. We're pleased that you came here, Peter, to receive the honorary degree of the faculty for architecture and planning, construction, and environment. It's a big faculty, and it's a very special occasion for our university. We are pleased that we can honor your scientific work in the theoretical architecture at TU Berlin. Thank you very much. As a small anecdote, I'd like to tell that when I first heard about the proposal from Herr Leiter to bestow you with the honorary degree, it was a little bit like Christmas for my children. When just before they open the presents, their eyes are open, they're glooming, and they have almost tears in their eyes because they're so happy about the Christmas event. And it was very similar when Herr Leiter proposed us and told us about all the achievements you've made and suggested to the university that we would give you the honorary degree. And so it was not really an issue of getting, as we usually do, many references and statements from other architects that you're an excellent architect. It was clear, or it is clear, that you are such an architect. Still, I would like to mention some points. There'll be a ratio afterwards that will be much more accurate than I can be about your achievements as an internationally recognized architect and educator. You belong to the top 5 most influential and most historically important educators living in architecture. Your large-scale housing and your urban design projects, as well as your innovative facilities for educational institutions, are a clear sign for our career of excellence in design, or your career of excellence in design, which we learn from as an university institution. Berlin can name 2 prominent buildings that go back that are your design. One is, of course, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, which received the Berlin Architecture Award in 2006, and we just had the occasion to talk about how the memorial came into place. We all followed in the time that it was decided some 10 years ago. And also there's the Haus in Friedrichstraße, which is known best as Checkpoint Charlie Museum, which you were very influential, which you designed as well. In the early 60s, you kind of invented together with other important thinkers architectural theory as a field in architecture. As we teach it today, in 1967, you founded the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, the director of which you were for 15 years or so, which is a widely known think tank for architecture in New York City. That was just a brief and short abstract of your earnings, and we'll learn about more of your achievements in the coming talks. Another indication for this special event is that 2 of the composers of music that we're about to hear, the composers are actually present here. So it's not Bach, obviously, but it's a rare occasion that the music that we play to honor a person is also accompanied by the composers of the music that we're playing. The music pieces have been chosen carefully, especially Scrivo in Verito from Elliott Carter. It was chosen by Kurt Foster, I understand, as something that will be best replacing or best showing, but displaying to us the spirit of Peter Eisenman. So there are long lists of awards. You have 5 honorary degrees from well-known universities, among which is the University Sapienza in Rome, the Pratt Institute in New York, and many others. You're a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You received the Golden Lion and the Stone Lion in 2004 and 1985, respectively, from the Biennale d'Architettura di Venezia. There's also the Wolf Foundation Prize in Arts that you received, and there are many other awards that I could not all list here. Still, and that's maybe my point. We hope that the honorary degree that we give you today still finds a special place in the collection of awards that you have received. So we'll honor you today as a remarkable and independent thinker and theorist of architecture. You have been influential in experimental and theoretical drafts of architecture. You have become very visible in the community. We are pleased that you're here today. Thank you for coming. And I'll pass on now to Frau Leibinger for her welcome words. Sorry. Frau Million, I was told that I wasn't sure whether you would be available, so I'll pass on to Frau Million. Thank you very much.
Yes, and as you can see, I'm not Jörg Stollmann. On behalf of Jörg Stollmann, who is one of our Vice Dean of the School of Planning and Building and Environment, he called in sick on a short note, and I told him I can take over. Of course, may not take fully his role, but nevertheless, it's my great honor to direct a greeting note of him to Peter Eisenman, and my colleague and architect Jörg Stollmann mailed this statement to me, and I read it, and it contains a number of very personal thoughts, and I decided I will read it out to you. So maybe you can pretend I'm Jörg Stollmann. Our School of Planning, Building and Environment is composed of various disciplines that all contribute to an understanding and betterment of the built environment, namely earth sciences, ecology, sociology, civil engineering, urban planning, landscape architecture, and also architecture. And as much as we operate in an interdisciplinary way, it is still difficult at times to discuss on a common ground. And we still have different disciplinary languages and agendas, especially when it comes to the very nature and role of design within our curricula and its relation to research and theory building. And when the Institute of Architecture, of which I'm part of, Jörg Stollmann, proposed the nomination of Peter Eisenman's Honorary Doctorate to the school, I was delighted by the way we were able to engage our colleagues in a discussion about architecture, architecture theory, and the agency of design. And I consider our discussion of Peter Eisenman's work as a crucial step in the process of establishing a common ground, a process of reflection and translation. And we were looking at the work at an architect who, with each piece of his design work, built or unbuilt, aims at nothing less than continuously questioning and reconceptualizing the profession, who would conceive of thinking in a sense of the analytical, critical reflection of designing and building a building as fundamentally interrelated task, who would only accept the traditional binaries of academia versus practice in as much as they challenge each other. And with the foundation of the legendary already mentioned Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York in 1967 and his 15-year of directorship, Peter Eisenman institutionalized this rigorous inquiry early on. The Institute, as my colleague Kim Förster has pointed out, was a research platform, a school of architecture, a cultural institution, and a publishing house. And even after its existence, the Institute impacted not only the architectural debate, the education of architects, but the cultural production in architecture for decades until the present day. He assembled architects, artists, urban planners, urban designers, sociologists, historians, and other intellectuals, as our school is today, which I think is very great, to give rise to a way of thinking that was as contemporary as it was uncomfortable. And I consider it of great relevance today to look back at this moment in time, the 1970s, namely, when Peter Eisenman shook the foundations of his modernist and neo-traditionalist colleagues alike, rejecting both functionality as well as mere aesthetic appeal as prerequisites for good architecture. Instead, the way in which a building was conceived, built and used should foster a critical attitude towards established norms, standards, and conventions. And only by being uncomfortable, I would interpret Peter Eisenman's work, and excuse my simplification here, can architecture achieve a process of intellectual discourse and thus have a relevant effect on the way we inhabit the world. And discussing Peter Eisenman with the different disciplines of our school, we discovered that we actually do share a conviction, the conviction of incessant criticism towards the positivist belief in the multi-power of technology, the belief that it is the role of academia to suspend this belief, to irritate, to question processes of normalization, that criticality does not necessarily have to be a retreat from practice or rejection of responsibility, but is achieved rather by embracing technology to use and abuse it in order to make a contribution to the contemporary production of space. And so let me end with quoting none of the influential philosophers that Peter Eisenman has been engaging with throughout his career, but with a German poet, Hilde Domin, who beautifully puts it into words what Peter Eisenman has done and keeps doing. Wer es könnte, die Welt hochwerfen, dass der Wind hindurchfährt. Who would be able to toss in the air the world that the wind sails through. And with these words, I close my greetings from Jörg Stolman. Thank you.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, meine verehrten Damen und Herren, dear Cynthia and dear Peter. You may not be aware of it, Peter, but you have accompanied my life for a very, very long time, both here in Berlin and in the United States. And I would like to name 5 places where our paths have crossed again and again. The first place was at Josef Paul Kleihus's office. That was the first time I had heard of you. I worked there in the 80s. It was the IBA area, the Internationale Bauausstellung time. Your beautiful drawings, and something very new to us. For the house Checkpoint Charlie, they were just laying around. We saw them, we discussed them, we were sitting directly at the source, and we had a fantastic time. Our second encounter, this time up close, was at Harvard GSD at the beginning of the 90s. And I was there to get my master's degree. You were a guest critic invited by Donna Robertson's studio. I remember exactly. We were presenting our work in the pit, and you were very bored by our work. You smiled exactly, really, seriously, only once, and not because you liked our schemes, just only because Rem Koolhaas walked by. To us students, you were, please excuse my openness, basically very unfriendly, and we were all afraid of you. Poetic justice, I later had the opportunity to intimidate you at least a little bit at the third place where we met, or where we meet each other regularly, at MIT, as we are both members of the visiting committee. We meet every 2 years for about 2 days, a 2-day conference where we, as external guests, consult and accompany the architecture department. I am scared. The German is shaking her head, you liked to say. Me, the strict German, you, always the gentlemanly statesman. But your humor always comes through. I know, in reality, that your fear of me is not that great. I got to know you during this time as a very good observer. I appreciate your intelligent comments and your ability to bring things precisely to the point like no one else. And we all witnessed this very well last night at the symposium over in the architecture department. The fourth and maybe most important place that has connected us was the field. As you humbly refer to the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe here in Berlin, you call it the field. What a modest description. I know the field, of course, from my own perspective. Even today, when I walk through it or drive by, it moves me. It moves me every single time. It moves me, lets me be still and pause. I heard you speak about the field during your speech at the Brandenburg Gate Foundation 3 years ago when we were celebrating the 10th anniversary of the memorial of the Denkmal der ermordeten Juden Europas in Berlin. No accusation, no blaming, neither in the speech nor in the Stehlenfeld. I, as a Berliner in German, am grateful for this. And as you stated at this time, it's no sanctuary, no place of dictated shock. It has become a place of everyday life. And so we meet each other today at the fifth place here in Berlin at my TU, where I studied and where I was a professor until recently. It is a great honor to me to welcome you today on behalf of the Technical University of Berlin on the occasion of your doctoral award ceremony. Welcome, Peter Eisenman, and I'd like to express my heartfelt congratulations. Thank you.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, sehr geehrte Frau Vizepräsidentin, Mitglieder der Fakultät, Studenten, Freunde und Feinde, es ist mir natürlich eine große Ehre, heute zu Ihnen zu sprechen. Und weil es nicht schwerfällt, in Peter Eisenman einen Meister zu erkennen, so ist es doch nicht leicht zu sagen, worin denn diese Meisterschaft bestehe. So to speak about Peter Eisenman in Berlin is to reckon with his presence in architecture during half a century. No other place hosts within close range two sites that bracket an extraordinary span of thought in architecture. The residential block at Kochstrasse and the memorial, of course, to the murdered Jews of Europe south of the Brandenburg Gate. And to these two we would have to add a third that is only present in the mind, but no less powerfully so for that reason, and that is, of course, the project for the Reinhardt House on the Friedrichstrasse. The two I mentioned, one within the reticulate of the Friedrichstadt, the other at its edges, the erstwhile Ministergärten. Of the project at Kochstrasse, only half was built. For the memorial, more than many can take does indeed emerge from the ground. The Kochstrasse block, had it been fully realized, would have revealed more than the torso oddly wedged into the cityscape at the checkpoint. As a summary of Eisenman's thinking during the two preceding decades, of which the incubator was, of course, the Institute, the Kochstrasse project not only proposes to reconsider architecture in its own terms, it also anchors the building in the historical terrain of the city, properly at the site of its massive devastation, with few remaining buildings and a gaping divide between east and west, which revealed itself to be a divide between two worlds. The block belonged to the first major expansion in the 18th century city. The Friedrichstadt extended westward to the Pariser and Leipziger Platz and at its southern tip to the Hallisches Tor, all named originally for their geometric shapes only, carré, octagon und rondel. Although preoccupied with matters that are more fundamental than historical, Eisenman brought to this project more than meets the eye. He excavated a past that turned out to be generic, and he embedded the site in an equally abstract grid of maps. Walkways would have elevated visitors to the level of the height of the wall, allowing them to peer down into the past of the city from a level historically defined only in 1961. And at certain points, through square towers, one could have caught sight of a quadrangular piece of sky. The ground slashed, the sky scissored into squares, the present a mere hypothesis. Had the project been built according to this full script, it might today be one of the exceedingly few to have the wall keyed into its very fabric, and in a sense it would become a map surviving of the Cold War condition on the globe. The past within sight and the future in abeyance. Conversely, a mere fragment of reality would now touch us as a sign of the imagination. The artifice of excavation brings a past to light that might have enlightened the city's history. And it would also have held within its reticulate a few surviving haphazard fragments, shards, with which post-war architecture needed to contend until it fulfilled this perverse wish of doing away with as many of them as possible. As it now stands, the building only hints at the condition that the original idea would have spelled out. Without its shadow, without the adumbration of its own past and future, the block at Kochstrasse is itself now a mere torso, a ruin of its idea. Perhaps the revenge of history strikes at a sore spot, checkpoint of the four powers, but an extreme point, an eye of the needle of history. It is a cruel and duplicitous history. It denies what was and obscures the future of the past. But Eisenman is no stranger to signs carrying their own shadows, identities, their own difference, objects, their uncertain meaning. If we take the unfulfilled status of the Kochstrasse block to be an accident, we recall the ever uncertain relationship that obtains between a place and its histories, and we also acknowledge the tenuous rapport between an object and its sign. From the very start of his studies, Eisenman thought that what makes a post in architecture is its dual existence as a post and a sign of a post. Only when that dual role was scripted into the building could the architect aim for architecture, rather than merely add to the built environment. A series of his houses, identified simply by Roman numerals like exercises or preludes to a work yet to come, this series of houses staked out the possibilities of scoring the relationship of object and sign, not in the manner of universalized semiotics, all the rage you recall in those years, and usually leading to an abbreviated vocabulary of motifs and types. Not as semiotics, but by contrast, Eisenman sought to locate architecture both within itself and without its narrowly technical nature. Perhaps the poster you may have seen with the zigzagging steps in red and green for our festival, perhaps the poster for the event gives a hint. Those red and green steps are not bilaterally symmetrical, but only rotationally related to one another. That is to say, they can be read upside down, and not only as bilateral correspondences. That is exactly what Eisenman had proposed with House 6. A post is not a post without assuming its role as a signpost of itself, and so a house can also be double-loaded. Rotated 180 degrees, the ceiling turns into the floor. The steps underfoot move overhead. The world is upside down, but in an exact mirror of its familiar self. There is then something into this identity that doesn't square, something to the object and sign that won't quite blend. Eisenman did not take this incongruence to be the stigma of architecture, but suspected in it a redeeming quality. His architecture makes visible, renders palpable what the relationship of body and shadow entails. a distant cousin of a Berlin story, Adalbert von Chamissos-Schlemihl. An individual can lose his shadow, a post its double, an object its visible meaning, but at their peril. It is in fact a business with the devil. What Eisenman has restored to architecture is its shadow, a range of ever intangible and yet physical qualities that hold up the elements of building by a structure with which they may not coincide. The monument to the murdered Jews of Europe similarly breaks the ground, slashes the sky, induces ever so slightly the sense of a barely perceptible transformation among rigid solids. It proves impossible to observe what yet pervades the whole with almost telluric force. At the same time, the easy way back to nature is barred. No transcendence is implied. The past will not go away, but memory will claim its share of the future. Such a future, in a visionary vein, pervades the city of culture at Santiago de Compostela, even if today there is, at times, a somewhat hollow ring to it. It is, I contend, what befalls us when we contemplate the future, unable to predict, blind to what will emerge, mournful perhaps about what will be gone, and irrepressibly hopeful that there will be a future, and brought into existence by a political act and comparable to the determination that sustained the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. The city of culture recreates the history of Santiago on a new site, from elements small and large, metaphorical and physical, arising from its hillside with a silent manifestation of a geological event. Filarete imagined a new Milan in the mid-15th century with his plans for Sforzinda, prolonging a past that was as much the stuff of historical fiction as the desire for the new. Recovering an imaginary past, Eisenman's City of Culture is all there to be recovered from the future. So let's excavate what is not yet and restore to it the shadow Schlemihl had haplessly sold to the devil, only to realize that he cannot live without it. The honorary doctorate conferred by the Technische Universität recognizes Peter Eisenman as an architect of ideas. Ideas he has been able to inculcate in the United States and in Europe during the half-century we've heard about. His Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies and the initiatives that have succeeded it lent a balancing pole to the high-wire architects in Europe and the United States. His friendship with Manfredo Tafuri spurred a critical debate that has given pause to facile arguments between the continents. His collaboration with Jacques Derrida left a richly documented record of mutual engagement in the form of Eisenman's beloved books. As a matter of fact, he is a Renaissance man precisely because he puts greater store in the word, the book, the line on paper than in buildings, having had to contend with their fragmentation, decimation, and fallibility from the very start. When Schinkel's Werke höherer Baukunst were published in Berlin in 1840 and the second fascicle in 1848, the architect acquired miraculously the title of Dr. Schinkel on the frontispiece. What better reason than to confer this honor onto Peter Eisenman in Berlin?
So I'll read to you the doctorate, as you see here. The Technische Universität Berlin herewith bestows the honorary doctorate, Dr. Ing E.H., on Professor Dr. H.C. Malt Peter D. Eisenman, Ph.D., professor at the Yale University of Architecture, New Haven, Connecticut, United States, in recognition of his outstanding achievements in philosophy and theory of architecture and his lifelong contribution to the advancements of the science of architecture and the built environment. As the founding director of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies and early pioneer of basic research in architecture, Peter Eisenman laid the foundation for his conceptualization of digitization processes in architecture. In his numerous scientific publications, his groundbreaking experimental designs, and his devotion to higher education, he is an intellectual conscience of architecture and a role model for many generations of scholars. Berlin, December 20th, President.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This guy wants to take a picture of us.
Oh, okay. I was informed that I wouldn't have to speak, but I get the sense that I have to say a few words. I feel very honored to be here, and I want to thank, first of all, Herr President, Professor Thompson. I want to thank Frau Vice-Präsidentin, Professor Arendt, and Herr Vice President, Professor Heiss, from the institution granting me the degree. I would also like to thank Professor Stolman for his greetings, for Regina. I don't know if this counts as 5 or 6 or 4.5, I'm not sure. For Claudia Stein, for the nice, wonderful interlude, which I think fit the occasion, and of course for my good friend Kurt Foster. We never speak, even though we share an office, so it's nice to hear what he thinks in public. I want to also thank friends and former students and colleagues who are here, very much Christine Feierreis, Herr Stimmann, one of my great Berlin friends, and of course Michel Naumann, who engineered this robot into the field of stones that you see. So it's his doing. I merely was the arms of this machine. I want to express in a very short narrative why I think I'm here, as opposed to someone else, let's say. People ask me often, how did you get into architecture? Was it always a dream of yours? The strong answer is absolutely not. I didn't know the word architecture when I went to the University of Cornell in the year 1950. I was studying organic chemistry because my father was an organic chemist, and that's what I understood I was to do. After one semester and taking a double load of German, you have to understand, usually a load is 3 hours. I was taking 6 hours of German at 8 o'clock in the morning every day of the week. And I would walk up an icy hill at Cornell. I remember going to my German class, and it was my undoing. I couldn't deal with German. And so I went to my professor and I said, I have to get out of this some way before I am thrown out of it. And my professor said, why don't you try architecture? So that's the beginning. So I was accepted in architecture. My father thought it was a joke when I told him that I was going into architecture, but nevertheless, and he said, as long as you do well. I ended up winning the prize. I went into the Army for 2 years, and I came out. I thought at that time that I wanted to be a hero architect. It was the time of Howard Rourke and Gregory Peck as Ian Rand's The Fountainhead, which we all believed in this book. We didn't know it was politically right or left. It was the mantra of what it was to be an architect was Howard Rourke. And so I wanted to be a hero, a St. George figure slaying the dragon. And so I went into architecture, and the idea of being a designer was the heroic image I had. And I went to work for a known German architect. The name is Walter Gropius. And this was supposedly the height of being next to a hero in the world. After 6 months of being with Walter Gropius, I became somewhat disillusioned, partly my own fault, but partly the environment created by this heroic figure. I then encountered a man by the name of James Sterling, who is also known in Berlin. And James Sterling was on his first professorship at Yale University, and he came to look at my work one evening in New York City. I remember vividly. And he said, you know something, Eisenman, and I had never met this man before. He said, you're really a good designer, but you don't know anything about architecture. And I thought, oh my God, what does that mean? You know, I'm a good designer and don't know anything. So he said, what you need to go and learn about architecture, you need to go to Cambridge University. And I thought, I'd never thought this. I mean, this was not the hero's way. And I went to Cambridge. I taught the first year. I never wanted to be a teacher, but they asked me when I arrived, could I be a teacher? And I said, why not? And every week I would read a book to stay a week ahead of my students. I hadn't read ever anything. And so then after the first year there, they asked me to stay on. It was quite interesting. And they said, I said, but I want to be a designer. I want to be a hero. And they said, why don't you consider doing a doctorate? A doctorate, I thought. What was I going to do for a doctorate? And this is true, and I really didn't know what to do. But anyway, I went through the discipline of the doctorate. In other words, the 3-year program. I came out of Cambridge with a totally useless in architecture degree, a doctorate in philosophy and architecture, in theory. And now I realize why I'm here is because I realized to be a hero meant not necessarily to be a designer, but to be a thinker. That you could be as much a hero as a thinker, doing architectural research, very similar to that scientific and engineering and research that goes on at a technical university. And therefore, I realize that even though I do design projects and they're very important to me, that fundamentally my being is in thinking and in thought. And therefore, it is really important to me that I stand here. It's important to me that this becomes the kind of prize that I win as a thinking hero. And therefore, I'm starting from my humble beginning as not understanding German, and I still don't, to be here and awarded this degree is very special for me. Thank you very much.
Okay. Herr Eisenman, congratulations for your honorary doctorate.
Thank you.
And how do you feel being back in the city in Berlin, which is so important important for your career?
Well, as I've often said, the one city that I could live in if I had to leave the United States would be Berlin. And I find it a very livable city, and it's a city that has always, in a sense, welcomed me. I remember, as Christine Fire said last evening, coming the first time was in '82, and coming quite regularly thereafter. I remember the first time I went to the Checkpoint Charlie site. It was an amazing feeling, and we had been told this was the site we were going to have a competition. And I remember walking close to the wall. I mean, neophyte politically as an American. I had been in Europe for over 20 years, but I had never been to Berlin. And standing close to the wall, I didn't know if I was inside or outside. There's a feeling, a very strange feeling, especially there was a Vopo guardhouse with a machine gunner pointed in our direction. And I thought, I don't know if he's defending me or attacking me. It wasn't clear at all. If you were a neophyte, you could have thought you were being in a prison as opposed to being on the outside of a prison. So that was an amazing moment. And I've always been interested in world history, and especially history of the Second World War. I remember as a kid, 10-year-old kid, I had a huge map of the Russian front, and I had pins on this map. I knew exactly who the German divisions and the Russian divisions. I was very taken with the event of Stalingrad and what proved to be the turning point of the war. So I was not involved in the Holocaust. I had no family here. My family had come from Germany in the 1840s. So I was an assimilated Jew, let's say. So the question of the Holocaust was not something that entered my psyche, let's say, being here. So I have a more pure relationship to Berlin today, and Berlin, let's say, in times other than the Third Reich. And to me, having that spirit, I'm reading right now Uwe Johnson's Anniversaries. It's translated in English. And I read a lot of German literature translated. So, and I worked with German artists, and there's a sense of belonging, let's say, and a sense I sense Berlin is a really interesting border between the East and the West, between what East and what is West. So I like living in borders. I feel I live in New York in a border of the United States. When you cross the Hudson River, you are in another world. And it's you have to realize how much you are embroidered when you are in New York and being part of that culture. I somehow feel a similar embroidered with being in Berlin. So To make a long story short, it's a great feeling to be here and to be recognized in my heroic field that I never thought I would be in.
So I infer that the trauma of your German lesson has not been that severe, or you have overcome it.
Yes.
Yes, I would like to get back to this point, to this chemistry thing, because this is very fascinating to turn from chemistry to architecture, although they share something. On the other hand, there are opposites. So chemistry deals also with space, with the combination, recombination of elements, and they produce something third, as architecture, as your architecture does. But the difference is that architecture has an effect on society, an immediate effect on society. It is critical, it is disrupting, especially in your practice. How did you find out that architecture is more than just assembling things, elements, and creating space, whatever it is?
First of all, Jorg, I hate to spoil your narrative. I was never in organic chemistry, okay? I was dropped into it by my father because he said, this is what you do when you go to university. You have to understand an innocence that pervaded the United States in 1950, 1940, 1930s. I mean, we're talking innocent people, all right? Probably brought into consciousness because of the Second World War, which changed radically the provincialism and the naivete of the country. Don't forget, in 1939 in New York, Fritz Kuhn and the German-American Bund had a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden with 20,000 people cheering for the Third Reich. Okay, and with marching stormtroopers and the whole lot. And this was an amazing occurrence. It was not about how wonderfully open and liberal America was. This was exactly the reverse, how awfully dangerous we were. And I think we were goaded into a war. I'm not sure what the feeling was that we certainly weren't saving people from the Holocaust. But anybody that thinks America was any different than Germany in a certain way has to rethink. So I had no idea what it meant to be an architect. I saw this senior counselor in my boys' dormitory was making models and drawings, and I knew as a kid I loved making models and drawings. That's all I used to do in my room, and my father couldn't understand what I was doing. You know, I invented all kinds of worlds. I had a thing called Eisenman Eastern News Service, which I would type out every day the news according to my world, and I'd call a friend and share with I mean, I was a bit of a crazy. I went in because I could draw and build models going to college. And that was all I thought. I did, and of course there was the Howard Rourke image. We all succumbed to that. But I had no particular mission, I had no particular objective, I had no particular sense other than the heroic possibility. But what that meant and how one would achieve that, I had no idea. I think that luck plays a lot in my world. I mean, I believe meeting Jim Sterling, having the dorm counselor making models, going to Cambridge and suddenly being thrust into teaching. I'd never an idea of being teaching. Then somebody saying, you should do a PhD. what was I going to do? And if I were to tell you my first thoughts on PhD, you would say, how did you ever get from there to the formal basis? So I believe I operated more as a sense of good luck, a sense of intuition, a sense of taking chances because I had no other alternatives. And, you know, I went from Cambridge to Princeton, and I was, in a sense, denied tenure. Not in a sense, I was. And so they said, you know, I'm going to leave. And I thought, what do I do now? And I thought, hey, let's make an institute. It was purely that I was out of work, and I had the possibility of an idea. And that became a really important moment in my life. And then I realized 15 years later, I got to get out of this. I will drown here and build buildings, because Manfredo Tafuri said to me once that no one will think about your ideas if you don't build. And so in a phase of my life, I did some rather interesting building projects, many of which were not realized. I have an enormous satisfaction for my teaching and my building. I've also been really lucky I have a partner, Cynthia Davidson, who's always looking at me to see if I'm on message, because I veer off message often when I'm on stage. And she keeps me on message. And it's really important. It's been important to me to share all of these things with her. And okay. I'm watching.
Yeah. There's one question I always wanted to ask you, you know. So you got the honorary doctorate for your achievements in the philosophy and theory of architecture.
Yeah.
But there's also an aesthetic side to your architecture. I found always this. Most people do not exactly understand what you are doing, what is behind, but they appeal by the aesthetics, somehow by the drawings, by the models, and then walking in the Mahnmal, it is an aesthetic experience that, of course, triggers thought. How does this come into your work? You know, these beautiful drawings and diagrams, and it's the opposite of the intellectual, or is it part of the intellectual?
Look, we all make decisions in our own way. We make decisions. I know that when I'm in the office, I make aesthetic decisions. I rail about something not looking right. But what I mean by aesthetics and what other people mean may be two different things. I'm really interested in the possibility of the aesthetic producing what we would, Jacques Derrida would say, is undecidability. In other words, that the form is not in a one-to-one relationship with the meaning or the context, etc. I've been able to do that in a way that's also been very fortuitous in the projects that we have done. I never, when I walk in the memorial, I didn't imagine that was what it was going to be. It's very different than when I walk in Santiago, I didn't imagine that was what it was going to be. So the being of the work that one produces has qualities, surely aesthetic, but those were not the guiding ideas in the work. I mean, I think there's something awfully foreboding about walking into the field of stones. I think there's something foreboding about going into the Art of Information. It has a certain strangeness to it. I'm interested in that strangeness and what provokes the strange. I've often talked about what it's like to be lost in space. Is it possible ever to feel lost in space for just a moment? Because you can't get lost. I can get out of this building, but could I feel somehow dislocated, displaced from being? That to me is an aesthetic phenomenon. That is, when you were with me this morning, we were in Michel Naumann's office and we were in the building and I couldn't get near the balcony because there's a feeling of nothing can happen to me, yet a feeling of weakness goes through me. And the same thing happens when I'm in the memorial or in Santiago. I feel that weakness, a different kind of weakness, but I think that's what architecture, in one sense, yes, does. But in the other sense, which I think is so critical and why I teach, is what is the nature of the role that feeling plays and engenders in the social fabric. In other words, in the cultural fabric of our time, what is the role of that feeling in architecture? And I think, for me, culture without that architecture is less. And my role that I've taken on, arrogated to myself, is that I am responsible for a cultural unconscious, let's say, for architecture. And nobody assigned me that role, and nobody says I do it well or not, but that's what I feel I am responsible for doing. So.
Well, one last question. You got an honorary doctorate from a technical university.
Yes.
From a research university. And if you talk about theory and philosophy, I think we have to distinguish two kind of architectures or design processes. One design process or architecture which is based on theory, and there's another process, design process which produces theory, which produces knowledge. So architecture in a sense where there is more to think than to see. Could Foster refer to you as a Renaissance man of the Renaissance? As a matter of fact, this is the concept of science, the Renaissance concept of science, where there's still science and the art is together. And what would you think if I just make this proposition that you are the man who brought these things, at least for the field of architecture, together in the sense that design processes turn into a knowledge production processes, as probably also the processes in the sciences. Sciences design processes or analog to the design processes as theory producing processes.
Well, first of all, I think that theory produces knowledge. And whether that knowledge is scientific knowledge, whether it's humanist knowledge, both go together in a certain way. I'm watching in Yale University, one of the great, in America, institutions of humanist knowledge. But you can see the barometer shifting toward the sciences or the technical world. And the necessity for that shift. Cornell University, my home university, now has a New York campus called Cornell Tech. I get really nervous about Cornell Tech because we used to be a humanist institution. But I realize that in the world that we live in, technology, the sciences, other than the humanist disciplines, are now claiming a necessary responsibility in the real world. And universities like Cornell and Yale have to recognize that, but at the same time, they cannot give up their humanist roots. architecture at Yale is not a money-making business. We don't get money for research, etc. But to be relevant, we have to, as it were, inculcate, let's say, in our students and our work, the possibility of the dialogue between the humanities and the sciences. And while it used to be just a name, the Faculty of Arts and Science in Cornell is now truly a Faculty of Arts and Science that is a necessary dialogue. And I think architecture is part of that dialogue that is necessary. And without it, the culture is diminished, the technology is diminished. Architecture shares as much technology as it does humanities. And I think to recognize that and to come to this university, for me, a technical university, and receiving an honorary doctorate is important as a sign of what is necessary for architecture as we go forward.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Please let me a brief explanation maybe. We did not choose Claudia because she's so brilliant and the world's best flutist. Of course she is. But more importantly, I think is just like Peter Eisenman. She's an incredibly analytic musician, at the same time an incredibly sensitive musician. And she combines both. And this is the wonderful thing in the music of Claudia Stein. So I was asked to open the buffet and don't let yourself disturb by the moving away of the chairs. I think it's opened, and yes, thank you very much.